Hello and welcome to Sri Ram's IAS. It's a leading center that teaches and coaches young adults who aspire to join the civil services. And I'm very happy to welcome the person who's with me is a retired diplomat, but a person with a wealth of experience in foreign policy on issues relating to national security. Let me welcome Ambassador Sham Saran. He's now 73. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1970, rose to the position of Foreign Secretary, the highest position in the Indian Foreign Service. He served in that position between July 2004 and September 2006. He was earlier India's envoy, India's ambassador to countries like Myanmar, Indonesia, Nepal, and also he was the High Commissioner of India to Mauritius. And after he completed his term, he retired as Foreign Secretary. He served as Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's special envoy on India-United States civil nuclear relations, and also was the special envoy and the chief negotiator on climate change on behalf of the government of India. And among the other positions he's held, he's been the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, and the head of the RIS, that's the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. And he's been the recipient of the Padma Bhushan and the author of a book called How India Sees the World from Kautilya to the 21st Century, published in September 2017. Thank you so much, Ambassador Sham Saran, for giving us your time. And let me start with a very general question, a very broad question, and then we can focus on specifics. The pandemic, the global pandemic, and the economic recession accompanying it, it seems to have shifted global power equations. How important are these changes? How significant are these changes? Are these changes tectonic? And if you can briefly outline, before we go into very, very specific issues, how have these changes impacted India's national security and strategic perceptions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Thakurta, for inviting me to this event. To answer your question, I would say that this is one of those inflection points in history where, if we are looking at historical events as a kind of a flow of a river, then what you are seeing today is that there is a river perhaps in spate. We do not know which direction it is going to go once the flood, in a sense, subsides. It is a completely new kind of a situation that we are facing. But the second more important point is, this particular transformation or this inflection point that we are talking about is not just a point, but it is still something which is in a sense playing itself out. We have not seen the end of this change. I mean, this change is still very much, not only proceeding, but perhaps even intensifying. So it is very difficult today to sort of make judgments about how this is all going to end in the future. But there are a few things which are very clear. One is that some of the very major changes in international affairs, in geopolitics, that we were already witnessing, for example, the shift in the center of gravity of the global economy from what I call the transatlantic to the trans-Pacific, this particular trend is getting intensified, which means that, what used to be the center of the global economy and in a sense the center of global power in the North American continent, in Europe, now that center of gravity is very much entrenched now in Asia. And this is probably going to get further intensified. So that is one very important observation I would like to make. The second is that if we are looking at a geopolitical order, then that geopolitical order is also undergoing a very big change. So what we see is a China which is, since the global financial and economic crisis, managed to do two things. One, the asymmetry of power with the United States of America, the world's most formidable power, that asymmetry shrank after the global financial and economic crisis. And with respect to India itself, the asymmetry of power between China and India, in fact, began to expand.
Okay.
And both these trends are, in fact, probably going to continue. So the setting that we will have once this pandemic, the health crisis and economic crisis starts receding, then what you will see after the waves have receded is a very, very different kind of world.
Okay. To summarize your introductory remarks, I mean, you've said we are currently at an inflection point in the history of humankind, and it's very difficult to predict the near-term future, leave alone the medium-term or the long-term future. But what is very clear, we see a clear shift in the global power balance, moving away from the transatlantic to the trans-Pacific. And specifically, you talked about the People's Republic of China, and especially the change in the asymmetry shrinking between the United States and China after the Great Recession of 2008. Let's focus a little bit about something that is very current and topical and in everybody's at top of everybody's mind, and that is the Chinese aggression in Ladakh along the line of actual control. Now, what we've seen really, events that started in May and continued for certainly over 2 months, has actually had a huge impact on, I should say, the relations between the two most populous countries on the planet, both in Asia and, I mean, you're talking about China and India. And the question that I have to ask is specifically, what really are the reasons for the kind of aggression in Ladakh along the line of actual control? We know the line of actual control was not clearly defined. There was a sort of competing claims and counterclaims. But the question I have is a little different. To what extent do you believe domestic developments within India have contributed to the Chinese aggression? Notably, the writing down of Article 370, Jammu and Kashmir no longer being a state but being two union territories. Also, we have the Citizenship Amendment Act. And when we had the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, saying in Parliament that we would get every inch of territory that we believe belongs to us, whether it be in Aksai Chin or along the line of control in Pakistan. So the question is, how far are domestic developments responsible for the Chinese aggression?
I think we should not overinterpret, the influence of these domestic developments as far as the recent events in India-China relations. Because don't forget that what we have seen happening in Eastern Ladakh is not a one-off. So we have had, a history of incursions by the Chinese side across the line of actual control. You remember what happened in Doklam. You remember what happened a few years ago in what is known as the Tepsang Plains. We have had, similar kind of incidents in the Pangtung Lake area. So it's not as if this is suddenly a new kind of behavior pattern on the part of the Chinese. What is different this time is that the scale of incursion, the deployment of large number of troops in these areas, the fact that there have been a series of events within a short period of time, including in the eastern sector, this is perhaps what is different from the past. So it is not as if, August 5, 2019 happened and then suddenly the Chinese reacted. Secondly, as far as, the Home Minister's statement in Parliament that you mentioned, he was not saying anything more than restating what are long-standing, claims of the Indian side with respect to territories which are currently illegally under the occupation of China or of Pakistan. There are two resolutions of the Indian Parliament which say that these are our territories and they must be returned to India. And any government would, I presume, would not hesitate to restate its position, as the Chinese themselves do whenever the occasion arises. So I don't think we should overinterpret that. But whether or not this was a factor, what happened with Jammu and Kashmir's reorganization, was this a factor in influencing Chinese perceptions about a changed relationship with India? Yes, because the Chinese themselves are saying it. So if you look at some of the Chinese commentary about what has been happening in Eastern Ladakh, there are analysts from the Chinese side who do point to the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir, the creation of Ladakh as a union territory, and also the statements made about Aksai Chin that may have caused anxiety on the Chinese side, perhaps a heightened sense of threat on the Chinese side, and did play a role in this respect. But as I said, there were other reasons that I would perhaps give greater credence to rather than this. This is more like a ex post facto justification for what the Chinese have been doing. The answer really lies elsewhere.
Okay. Ambassador Shyam-Saran, you are saying that what is different this time is that the scale of what has happened. You know, we've seen 20 casualties on the Indian side, including Commanding Officer Babu. We do not know if the casualties have been there on the Chinese side. If so, how many? We have no idea. If you are to read the Global Times, which is supposed to be kind of like a mouthpiece of the government of Beijing, of the government in Beijing, you would say that China has deliberately not disclosed the casualties on their side because it doesn't want to get into some sort of a competition about winners and losers. Be that as it may, never have we seen this kind of scale of operation and so many casualties since 1962. And I want you to also sort of add a little bit about where diplomatic initiatives have not worked, or how should we interpret the fact that since Mr. Narendra Modi became Prime Minister of India in May 2014, he's met the Chinese President Xi Jinping at least 18 times at various fora, including two one-on-one meetings at Wuhan and Mahabalipuram. They sat on a swing on the banks of the Sabarmati. So somewhere along the line, what is it? Is it somewhere diplomatic failure on India's part, our inability to understand what was the Chinese were thinking of?
I think 2 or 3 points need to be made here. One is that while summits between leaders are certainly important, even a personal relationship that may be established between leaders, yes, they are important. But at the end of the day, what really matters is how those leaders represent the country's interests. So interests of countries cannot be, in a sense, transcended by personal chemistry between leaders. I think we should understand that very clearly. We should not emphasize the importance of personal relations amongst leaders. Obviously, there has been a change in the context of India-China relations over the last several years. So, if you take, say, 2005 as a certain high point in India-China relations, what was the stated sort of consensus of the leaders regarding the trajectory of India-China relations? One was that both India and China are today, that is in 2005, are the most important emerging economies with a much greater influence on international affairs than before. In that context, India is not a threat to China, China is not a threat to India. that India is an opportunity for China and China is likewise an opportunity for India, that India and China together as the two largest emerging economies, if they work together, they can have a major impact on the emerging geopolitical situation and in the negotiation of important global regimes such as in climate change or cybersecurity or in terms of non-proliferation. And for being able to do that, India, China should resolve legacy issues such as the border issue between the two countries. That was the kind of a consensus which actually existed by 2005. This is what I'm saying has undergone a change, particularly after the global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008, because from that time onwards, China began to benchmark itself with the United States of America as the leading power in the world, not as an emerging economy in the same league as India. So that context of India-China relations has been undergoing a very, very rapid change. Today, China looks at India as being in some kind of a subordinate position, as not being in the same league as China, and India needs to understand that. So, what is the big change? If it was like Deng Xiaoping told Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1988 that you cannot think in terms of an Asian century without the emergence both of China and India, and China and India working together. Only then is an Asian century possible. Today, the Chinese perception is that the Asian century can only be a Chinese century. Nobody else has a place as far as that order is concerned. And the sooner the Indians realize that, the better it is. We are 5 times your size. You are nowhere, in the run. So what has been happening at the border, you should see it in that larger context of a very changed, relationship between China and India, where the sensitivities of the Indian side, say on the border issue, is no longer as important to China as it was in the past.
Right. You have articulated the position very, very clearly. The Asian century was supposed to be India and China's century. These were supposed to be the two largest emerging economies on the globe. They were the fastest growing economies. But as you have rightly pointed out, though our economies were more or less on a similar plane in the early 90s and the late 80s, today the Chinese economy is more than 4 times bigger than that of India. The per capita income, it's not just the size of the economy in terms of gross domestic product. The per capita income of China is about more than 3 times that of India. So having said that, the question is, if both India and China have a stake in stronger, at least economic relations, then today those seem to be particularly strained. We have seen over the last decade or thereabouts, China replacing the United States as India's biggest trade partner. In recent months, we've seen India placing restrictions on investments from China, and it's not just a question of banning 59 computer applications. Relations seem to be at a trade and economic relations seem to be at a particular kind of a low at this juncture, and there is a kind of a xenophobia, a kind of jingoism that seems to be prevailing in certain sections of our society. When you look at relations between the economic relations, I'll just make one point. The Indian pharmaceutical industry depends on Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredients to the tune of roughly about 70%. That means 70% of all the pharmaceutical products that are made in India are based on Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredients. I mean, if you look at specific ingredients, like there are some life-saving drugs like ibuprofen, like paracetamol, we're almost 100% dependent on China. So the question, this economic relation, I mean, this strain in the economic relations, there's every indication that it's going to hurt India more than China. Your views?
Oh, I agree with that. We should be very careful and selective in the manner in which we try and confront what is also a Chinese economic and commercial challenge. There is no doubt that there is a commercial challenge as well. After all, why have we walked out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP? Mainly because we feel that this will become like a free trade agreement between India and China, and our market will be flooded with cheaper Chinese goods. So the sense of threat from China on the economic side is also not something which has suddenly erupted because of what has happened in the past. What it has done is that it has sharpened that sense of threat. It has sharpened that sense of hostility to what is seen as a Chinese mercantilist approach in terms of commercial exchanges. But having recognized that threat, you should be very careful that you do not undertake measures in a sort of a knee-jerk reaction that causes, as you said, more pain to the Indian side rather than pain to the Chinese side. Because, the volume of trade between India and China is a small fraction of China's total trade. I mean, we know that the trading volume that China is responsible for as the largest trading nation in the world is more than India's GDP. That's the scale that you are talking about. So even if you take certain measures, like, for example, what you mentioned in banning some of the Chinese apps, or perhaps maybe we will keep Huawei out of the telecommunication market of the future. Yes, but we should not do this in a manner that causes dislocation and disruption on the Indian side. You need a certain time period over which you can try and reduce that dependence. For example, you mentioned the APIs. You remember that at one time the APIs used to be made in India. It is more a recent phenomena that APIs production has moved to China. Why? Because it is more competitive. So the answer to the Chinese challenge, I would say, is how to make India's economy a globally competitive economy. So even if we are talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat as a reaction to what we are seeing from the Chinese side, well, that Atmanirbhar Bharat needs to be directed towards making India a globally competitive economy. Only then can you meet the Chinese commercial and economic challenge. But you should be very selective in the manner in which you are trying to cause pain to the Chinese side, because your ability to cause pain to the Chinese side, realistically speaking, is somewhat limited.
Well, Ambassador Shamsaran, you mentioned about India not getting in part of the economic, the comprehensive economic sort of cooperation, the regional cooperation program, not only involving the People's Republic of China, but also the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because India felt that it would not really gain very much from that sort of a partnership or from that economic arrangement. At the same time, sticking to the economic side of it, and this again is linked to the political part of it, and especially the dispute along the line of actual control, is that India also was the only major country that opposed China's BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. And the initiative to have these all-weather highways all the way through disputed territory, through Tibet and Xinjiang province, to the warm water ports, not only of Gwadar in Balochistan in Pakistan, but also in Chabahar in Iran. So in that sense, trade and economic relations get sort of rather intimately intricated and interlinked with the issues about disputed territory and then military incursions. Your views, sir?
I agree. I mean, one of the reasons why we had strong reservations about the BRI was precisely because of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which was going through territory which we consider to be our own, which is Gilgit and Baltistan. Also, with regard to the BRI, there was a larger issue, and I think the Indian caution was well-founded because, you see, unlike the other project, which is also China-led, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, or you take the BRICS Development Bank. Two of these are multilateral institutions, in the shaping of which India and other shareholders played a very important role. Their personnel policies, their lending policies is not China determined. These are determined as consensus amongst the participating countries or shareholders. Now, unlike the AIIB or the BRICS Development Bank, the BRI is a Chinese designed and a Chinese financed initiative. It is a string of bilateral partnerships between China and the partner country. It is not multilateral in character. We have not had any say in the design of that initiative. So the caution has been, I think, well-founded, and you see that some of the points that we raised with respect to financing, the debt burden, for example, because of very opaque financing methods being followed. This is something which is being borne out by what we see happening to, say, Sri Lanka, to many countries in Africa. So I would say that with respect to the BRI, I think India has taken a stand which in fact is becoming also reflected in the stand being taken by several other countries. But the point that you made about China, in a sense, hardwiring the world through the new transport infrastructure. Because when you hardwire the world through these new transport corridors, even digital corridors, naturally this begins to influence trade flows as well, investment flows as well. So I think we should take this initiative very seriously and see, are there ways in which, okay, if this infrastructure is being put in place, if it is not for exclusive Chinese use, can we also utilize it as a platform? Second is, are we in a position together with, say, other like-minded countries like Japan, like the United States, like Australia, to try and also invest in new transport corridors together, like we have been doing, for example, in Sri Lanka, which we are trying to do in Myanmar. These are some examples of where we are trying to provide better alternatives to these partner countries. But it is still, I would say it certainly does not match at this point of time what the Chinese are.
Okay. Ambassador Shamsaran, I'm going to get back to you with a few more questions on the Quad, Japan, Australia, United States, India. But before I do that, I'd like to take you up on some of the points that you mentioned. You talked about Sri Lanka. Now, here, we know that there are major issues or major disputes in the South China Sea. Islands being claimed by not just Japan, but also Vietnam. And contentions about whether or not China is violating the international law of the sea. Now, even as these disputes remain unresolved, we are seeing attempts by Beijing to develop what is called the proverbial string of pearls or the string of jewels, where you have a series of ports that come all the way from the South China Sea all the way to the Horn of Africa, including the port in Sri Lanka, which is Chinese funded, and Sri Lanka doesn't have today the wherewithal to repay that money to China. So effectively, because the ownership vests with China. So we're seeing the ambitions of China in some ways, coming to the fore, and especially post-pandemic, we see do we see an overconfident China or an excessively aggressive China? I mean, this is my question to
you. Yeah. So let me begin by repeating something that I have said a number of times in the recent past, which is that you see now the United States of America in a sense, waking up to the Chinese threat and declaring, in a sense, an all-round kind of confrontation with China. On the other hand, you see greater activism on the part of China, whether it is with respect to the South China Sea, it is with respect to what it is doing post-pandemic in places like Western Europe, amongst the ASEAN countries. We see a new level of aggressiveness, of which what has been happening at the India-China border is a part. However, what I would say is that while the United States of America has woken up to the China challenge late in the day, in a sense closing the door after the horse has bolted, on the Chinese side, I believe that they have declared victory too early. And that is where the aspect which you talked about, overconfidence, and a sense that this is our moment, this is our time, I think has proved to be somewhat premature. So what we see today is that all the kind of hubris born out of, yes, spectacular success on the economic side of China's development over the last 40 years. There is no two ways about it that they have been very successful. So there is, in a sense, a certain basis for feeling that they have in a sense made it. The problem is that number one, they merely having expanded economic capabilities and even military capabilities does not automatically translate into international leadership. You need something more than that. So you have the United States of America and the West, which is obviously in relative decline, but you take just one metric, which is with respect to, say, the financial markets. Despite the fact that China is today the largest trading power in the world and has been trying desperately to so-called internationalize the Chinese currency, the yuan, it has not succeeded. Why? Because it is not willing to accept the possible political and social consequences which may arise due to the inevitable volatility of the currency, if it is a freely convertible currency. And so this puts a kind of a bar on how far it can go really to emerge as a key international financial market. Why was Hong Kong very important to China? The reason why Hong Kong was very important to China is that the Hong Kong currency is a fully convertible currency.
And Hong Kong is an important financial center.
Right, right. So what we are seeing today is a lack of appreciation on the part of the Chinese leadership that as far as these other metrics of power are concerned, even if you have economic capability or military capability, this is one to somehow or the other try to project yourself as a superpower in the same category as the United States, or being in a position to put an alternate order to a Western dominated order. It is not so easy. So that is why I say that there is a disconnect in a sense. The United States of America, as I said, has allowed this threat to perhaps expand beyond its capability to hold back, but the Chinese are not able to step in their shoes, which is the reason why I said that during this pandemic and afterwards, you are probably going to see a continuance of a very disturbed, a very, turbulent and volatile international situation, where stability will probably take some time to come back. I do not see a stable order emerging anytime soon.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you a little bit about the global order, the changes in the global order, the likely changes in what is happening with specific reference to India and India's security prospects. And the meanings of words like non-alignment or phrases like non-alignment or strategic autonomy. But before I ask you these questions, I want to ask you a few questions about two of our neighbors, and specifically Nepal. Yeah, you were India's ambassador to in Kathmandu. Now, what we've seen recently, we know that China is a landlocked country. It's sandwiched between the two big, most populous and most powerful Asian countries, China and India. And then this is not new. This has been going on for a long, long time. But what is new is Prime Minister Oli suddenly saying, okay, the map has changed. Kala Pani, which is in Pithoragarh, in Uttarakhand, is now ours. These claims have been made in the past, but these claims are suddenly come to the fore. Why is the question? To what extent has China or the Chinese aggression in Eastern Ladakh or the overall scenario in India, where India is seen to have become economically weaker after the pandemic, has, in your opinion, prompted the Prime Minister of Nepal to do all that he has done in the recent past?
So I think we have to recognize that even though India is the strongest power as far as its economy is concerned, as far as military capabilities are concerned in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, its smaller neighbors will always try to, in a sense, balance you by bringing in external powers. This has been going on, as you yourself said, for quite some time. So playing the China card is something which is almost inevitable in terms of our relationship with our neighbors. You have seen that this has worked perhaps in a more acute form with Pakistan, but it is also true of our other neighbors, playing this China card. So that does not surprise me. But what is perhaps very ominous is the kind of, brinkmanship that we are seeing on the part of the Prime Minister Oli. And it's not only Prime Minister Oli. After all, this whole Kala Pani claim in the expanded form was raised first by the Nepali Congress, which is supposedly more friendly towards India. And then it was picked up by the UMN or the Communist Party, of Nepal. Now, here what we are seeing is a kind of a intermix of domestic issues in Nepal and external issues. What is the domestic issue? A leadership challenge to Prime Minister Oli from within his own party. Therefore, he has been desperately trying to somehow deflect attention away from that by playing the nationalist card.
Including making claims about the birthplace of Lord Ram.
Yeah, yes. So all this is part of that same exercise, because you have always tried to play the nationalist card by putting India as the bogey. And this has been going on for years. This is not something recent. But this has been perhaps unprecedented in the sense that, what was originally probably a solvable dispute on Kala Pani, about 35 square kilometers of territory, which was expanded to something like 400 square kilometers of territory, unilaterally.
Okay.
By just identifying one of the rivulets as the real source of the Kala Pani river. So this is something which has been encouraged by China, and don't forget that maybe in the last few days you have seen that there have been mention of troop movements by the Chinese even in the Lipulek Pass area. I know this is all kind of political moves, not so much military moves, but political moves to in fact tell you that we can create trouble for you wherever we want, whether it is in Sri Lanka, whether it is in the Maldives, whether it is in Nepal. See what they have done with Bhutan, where they have raised a new claim with
Absolutely.
regard
I mean,
to one of the
it had never happened before, Ambassador Shams.
which had never been raised
Yes, I mean, for the
before.
first time, we know there was that point, the tri-junction, Sikkim, Bhutan, China. But
Yes,
for the first time, the China is claiming Bhutanese territory. I mean, and obviously this has some implications for India.
Yeah, so it is part of a certain pattern, and I would say that at least as far as the current leadership in Nepal is concerned, that is Oli himself, this particular leadership has decided that its own survival and its own power is better served by moving into more closely into the Chinese orbit rather than in terms of its relationship with India. That is the reality. Now, these have major implications for India's neighborhood policy. We say neighborhood first, but that neighborhood first has not quite been translated into carrying forward in fulfilling the many commitments which we have made with respect to our neighborhood. Frankly speaking, India has tremendous assets in terms of, really establishing itself as a partner of choice for your neighbors, because you can actually be the engine of growth for the entire region, should you choose to be. But we talk about connectivity. You can set up a glass stop highway between India and Bangladesh, but if trucks have to wait at the border for 3 days, 4 days, that's
Ambassador Sham Saran, our conversation got interrupted due to an unstable internet connection. You were talking about the road corridor through Bangladesh, and you were talking about trucks being held up for 3 or 4 days. At the same time, you were saying we have to continue with our neighborhood first policies. Please elaborate on what you were saying.
Which has been the highest priority in our foreign policy must be to build our relations with our immediate neighbors. And that makes sense because unless you manage your own periphery, whether a regional role or a larger global. So this is fundamental component of your foreign policy. And what I was trying to put across was that the assets which we have in order to build those relations, those assets are not being leveraged properly. So what are those assets? India is the largest economy in the region. If it so chooses, it could become the engine of growth for all your neighbors. It could become the economic partner of choice for all your neighbors. But for that, you need to open out your markets to whatever your neighbors are able to sell to you. You need to be a major investor in all your neighboring countries. You should become the transit country of choice for your neighbors. Let Nepal use whichever highway they want, whichever railway line they want, whichever port they want for their imports or exports. In terms of the size of the Indian market, even if your neighbors sold everything that they produce to the Indian market, it would still be a small fraction of the Indian market.
Okay.
So, we are not actually able to utilize the size of the Indian market, the sophistication of the Indian market to actually, as I said, become the economic partner of choice for our neighbors.
All right.
And this is a big lacuna.
Moving from economics back to politics, you think India could have dealt with the whole issue of the Rohingya Muslim refugee problem from Myanmar differently? It was perceived, rightly or wrongly, that India was less sensitive, less empathetic to their plight than Bangladesh.
Well, part of the problem is that, during the last several years, what are foreign policy issues have become entangled in domestic politics. So if you say, look at our relationship with Pakistan, it is very much linked to the kind of communal dynamic which you have seen in India over the past. If you see our relationship with Bangladesh, obviously, if your home minister is going to call, immigrants coming from Bangladesh as termites, don't be surprised if there is a negative reaction in Bangladesh, right?
Right.
So,
You mean
it is the Rohingya issue is also become embroiled in that domestic politics. Why?
in
Because
the communal
Rohingyas
place.
are being regarded as Muslim immigrants who could be even perhaps terrorists, who knows, and therefore your ability to play any kind of a mediatory role in the handling of the Rohingya crisis is then undermined in its credibility by this kind of perception that you have amongst the political leadership in India.
No, what you're saying, and you're saying it very bluntly and candidly, is internal domestic developments in India, whether it be the Citizenship Amendment Act, the description that the Home Minister used of illegal immigrants being described as termites, all of them certainly hasn't helped. When you look at India's relations with Pakistan, these two seem to be not at all in a good shape. I mean, we can debate and discuss the impact that Pulwama and Balakot had on domestic politics or the elections, because it happened just before the 2019 Lok Sabha elections. But at this particular juncture, it seems very, very hard. It seems there is interest on both sides, on Imran Khan's side and Narendra Modi and Amit Shah's side, not to have cordial relations with our neighbor. I mean that's India-Pakistan relation. Is such a would I be correct in arguing along such lines?
India-Pakistan relations have been adversarial and will remain adversarial. The challenge for India has been how to manage that adversarial relationship in a way that does not, descend into armed conflict between the two sides, because that would be very, very damaging both to our interests as well as to the interests of Pakistan. So we have tried to, have a certain balance in our relationship with Pakistan. Also because if there are tensions between India and Pakistan, because they are two nuclear weapon states, immediately, concern rises in the international community, in the United Nations. So while you want that this should be handled only bilaterally, again, you should not be surprised if there is, interference from other quarters. And today that interference is even from China.
Correct.
So I would say as a professional diplomat, I would say that it does not make sense to have two live borders to deal with. So today you are dealing with a live border on the western side, you are dealing with a very live border on the northern side. This is not a good position to be in.
Ambassador Shamsaran, after the pandemic, the accompanying economic recession, what we are seeing, many believe that we have this Cold War, many people describe it as another Cold War between the United States and China. War on information technology, war on trade. And India seems to be the grass under the that proverb, the two elephants they are fighting and we are the grass under the feet. Why do I ask this? Because China seems to look at India having moved very firmly into the Western camp, into the Quad. I mean, the Japan, Australia, United States, and India camp, or the Quad. Now, just this Quad, will it acquire muscle in the near future? And would this not lead to India's relations with China becoming even more adversarial? This is my question for you, sir.
So the first point to be made is that, the more isolated you are, the greater the pressure that will fall on you. So China's ability to put pressure on you, to turn the screws on you will be that much greater if you are seen as not having, strong network of relationship with other major powers. So you should never get into a position where you are in that kind of an isolation. My own experience has been that the stronger the relationship that India has with the United States, with Japan, with other major powers, the greater the room for maneuver you have vis-a-vis China. So I do not accept the argument that if we are trying to be part and parcel of a coalition of countries which are as concerned about the assertiveness of China, its unilateral assertion of power as we are, then I see no reason why we should not have that kind of a coalition of interests. Yes, we have not made the decision to become part of a military alliance with these countries. That would be a step a bit too far, I think, at this point of time. What may happen in the future, I do not know. But I think it makes sense for us to have this strong network of support, which also can help in terms of developing over a period of time our own economic and military capabilities, technological capabilities.
Okay.
Because the United States of America, Japan, these are also very, very important sources of capital, of high technology, which we need in order to develop into a greater, a more credible and strong power. So I would say that these relationships should not be seen in the sense of, this will provoke the Chinese. I think what will provoke the Chinese to be even more obstreperous than they are is if you are seen as being, in fact, more isolated than is the case, so far.
Okay, we've seen various kinds of groupings, and India has all kinds of relationships. We not only have the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is really the richest countries in the world. We also see the group of 77 of developing countries, but we also see other groupings. Today the G20 arguably has become more influential than before. But there is today even a talk of a D10, a so-called democratic countries coming together. Is this a feasible idea, or is it just all in the air? It's an idea that will fail. Your views, sir?
What is the purpose of such a grouping? I think that is the question that we first need to ask. Merely getting a group of democracies together is not necessarily going to help in terms of advancing your interests. Don't forget that in 2004, 2005, President Bush of the United States of America had also launched a community of democracies. But that community of democracies had several countries who could not quite be described as democracies. So the selection of countries was not necessarily on the basis of democratic values, but in the terms of how close they were to the United States. So I think we should be a little careful in terms of joining these kind of groupings. Of course, we should not be defensive about being a democracy.
All right. Okay.
And there is no reason why, if there is a forum for democracies to be able to exchange views, to be able to celebrate the fact that we are democracies, I would say yes, certainly. But I'm not very sure that what is the purpose of this D10 which is being talked about. What is it going to be its mandate? What will be its membership? This is something that we should be a little cautious of.
All right. My last question to you. This phrase, non-alignment, or this, you can say this hyphenated word, used to be very important in India, right? From around soon after India became politically independent. It was very important right through the 50s, the 60s, and even the 70s. And then it somehow fell out of favor, let me put it this way. And then people were talking about non-alignment point 2, and people were talking about strategic autonomy as new phrases. So if you again look at the big picture and look at India's strategic interests and in the prospects of stability, peace, security, prosperity in Asia, in this part of the world, you talked about the Asian century becoming a Chinese century. If you can sort of, in your closing remarks, come back to the big picture and talk about the design and the intricacies of India's foreign policy in the changed environment, post-pandemic, post economic recession?
So, we should always assess the stated sort of foreign policy posture in terms of its historical context. And I do believe that in the context of the post-Second World War geopolitical situation, where you had a confrontation between two military blocs, two ideological blocs, India, which had just gained independence after a very, very long and difficult, independence struggle, I can quite appreciate that the leadership of newly independent India did not want to be once again a junior partner in an alliance headed by one or the other party. So it did respond, the posture of non-alignment did respond to those very, very strong feelings which were shared by Indians in general, that we do not want to be in a subordinate position again, that decisions about India's future on issues which are of vital interest to India, these decisions must be taken in New Delhi, not in other capitals of the world. So in that sense and in that historical context, of course, that was, I think, in my view, a very appropriate kind of posture for India today. Now, what has not changed, even if the label of non-alignment is, put aside, or we are using some other, term, there is a certain consistency in India's foreign policy in terms of what I just said, that succeeding leaderships in this country and a certain broad political consensus has supported the view that on issues which are of vital interest to India. Okay, so these are issues, not each and every issue, but these are issues of vital interest to India. These decisions should be taken in a relatively autonomous manner by India. You cannot have 100% independence, you cannot have 100% autonomy in a landscape where there are competing states. You have to make compromises. So what we have seen since India's independence is leaderships of different political hues saying that with respect to India's vital interests, these decisions must be taken in a relatively autonomous manner in India by Indians. And that is the, basis of, the term even strategic autonomy. So whatever label it may be, I think this is a very consistent principle with respect to Indian foreign policy. Don't forget that non-alignment did not prevent India from having a strategic partnership with the Soviet Union from 1960 to 1990. So I think we should be a little careful in the manner in which we interpret these terms. It was not that India was a very passive kind of a country which was always sitting on the fence. No. As a non-aligned country, in fact, India was accused of taking a moral position on so many issues. It was very active on the international stage. It was a very major actor in the United Nations. So I think, we have to judge policies in the historical context in which those policies were adopted and see what elements of that strategy continue to be relevant in today's world. So if you are asking what is the right kind of a foreign policy for India to take on today in circumstances that we find ourselves, I would say that it should recognize that number one, we are living in a very uncertain world, a very volatile world, that there is probably going to be an extended period of confrontation between China and the United States of America. We don't know what the eventual denouement of that rivalry would be, but we will have to carefully locate ourselves so that we do not, as you said, become the grass which is trampled by the confrontation between the degree of autonomy with respect to our major interests. It may need for us to be closer to the United States with respect to certain issues. It may need for us to, in fact, oppose the United States on issues which are perhaps harmful to our interests. And there may be, even with China, despite the very negative turn the relationship has taken, in the future, could there be perhaps areas of convergence between the two sides? Are there issues, for example, in G20? We will be hosting the G20 in 2022. Are there issues on which there may be some convergence of interest? We should not close our minds to that. A certain degree of flexibility, a certain degree of nimbleness is something which will be required in trying to navigate the world that is coming into existence post the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Shyam Saran, for highlighting and explaining in such detail why India's foreign policy needs nimbleness, flexibility, nuance in this extremely volatile world that we are living in. I am very sure that this conversation will benefit the young adults who are aspiring to be civil servants, who are part of the coaching center at Sri Ram's IAS.
I hope so.
Thank you once again for being with us, for giving us your valuable time.
My pleasure.
And you just heard and watched Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I conclude the recording.
Thank you.